Thank you for visiting Nancy's Classic Bedtime Stories. And tonight we're continuing in William F. Buckley Jr.'s Let Us Talk of Many Things, the collected speeches. And we begin. An Island of Hope. A speech at a rally in behalf of the Republic of China, Taiwan, sponsored by the Committee of 1 Million, Carnegie Hall, New York, September 21, 1961. The Committee of 1 Million against the admission of Red China to the United States was a very active lobby during the 50s and 60s. In the fall of 1961 is organized a rally to register opposition to the admission of Peking, which was finally done 10 years earlier. See my speech to a conference sponsored by the American Asian Educational Exchange, October 29, 1971. General Edwin A. Walker, mentioned in the final paragraph, had been stationed in Germany and was called back when he gave a vitriolic speech deriding various establishment figures. On his return to the United States, he joined forces with Billy James Hargis in radical right activity. In April 1963, an attempt on his life was made by a rifleman who missed his head by a few inches. The failed assassin was Lee Harvey Oswald, who 7 months later assassinated John F. Kennedy. We meet here tonight to raise our voices on a matter of great importance to the survival of freedom, hoping that the reverberations from this gathering will cause a fresh wind to blow in the United Nations, to give it courage to resist its increasing colonialization of the Soviet Union. Colonization by the Soviet Union. The crisis man faces are of two kinds. Some we cannot avoid, as we cannot avoid a flash flood or a prairie fire. Others we see approaching with a dreadful clarity of vision, and these we can hope to do something about. True tragedy is man-made. Hurricane Carla was a catastrophe. It was not a tragedy. Tragedy results from a flaw in the human character, a weakness in the human will, an imperfect moral understanding, a failure of courage. The overarching tragedy for the past 15 years has been the failure of the West's strategic vision, a moral failure, essentially. It has led to a long series of defeats. It led to Korea and to Suez and to Cuba. The failures were so human, not natural. In refusing to win the war in Korea and thus to pursue the opening that events had given us, we lost the opportunity to speak back to history and reclaim China. In failing to support the English and French and Israelis in Suez, we failed to say to Africa what needed to be said, that our retreat from colonialism would be phased with the great strategic imperatives of freedom and justice. In Cuba, at the Bay of Pigs, we faltered, and so made known that we would tolerate an enemy beachhead in the Western Hemisphere. We showed by our deeds that we would sooner appease the neo-democratic divinities of world opinion than follow the imperatives that come from the planning boards of Western survival. I count as no less important the crisis that impends in the United Nations. There, not a man stands to be shot. There is no Yalu, no Port Said, no Bay of Pigs, but only file upon file of wooden desks and paper clips and earphones. The actors are not soldiers, but diplomats. Yet it is a great battlefield all the same, and what hangs in the balance is the hopes of good men in the Far East and everywhere else. There are those in America who make a religion of pragmatism, who say that ours is never was and never should be a nation wedded to abstract ideals, that the genius of American politics is not utopian stargazing, not the pilgrim's search for great metaphysical realities, but rather the search for the practical thing, the doable thing, the thing that works for the United States. I have philosophical disagreements with that school of thought, but I am ready, as perhaps you are, to tell the pragmatists that we are willing to wage the fight on Red China on their terms, 3 short years ago, we were told by the doomsayers that unless we surrendered Quemoy and Matsu, we will bring on a regional war whose sympathetic detonations would explode right on our own hearths. Jean Foster Dulles stood firm, and he prevailed. And lo and behold, the 1,000 persons who met in Harvard Square to denounce his policy of firmness as a death warrant pronounced upon their invaluable selves are with us yet. And so, too, are the 50,000 Chinese who continue to enjoy the freedom of their beleaguered little islands. Indeed, Mr. Richard Rovere of the New Yorker, concertmaster of the Doomsayers at the time of the crisis, has had the courage to say that the turn of events proved that Mr. Dulles was correct. That by refusing to yield Quemoy and Matsu, we did not detonate a world war, but rather vouchsafed a continued liberty to Quemoy and Matsu, and breathed into the free peoples of the Far East a deep and revivifying lungful of life. The United States, the free peoples of the Far East learned, was alive after all, and from our life they drew breath. Our action was not a reflexive act of moral rectitude. If I must die a violent death, I speak only for myself. I did not choose to die for Quemoy or for Matsu, or for Berlin, or for Formosa. I would die willingly only for my own country, for my family, or my faith. The decision to hang on to Quemoy Matsu was a strategically intelligent decision designed to protect not Quemoy Matsu, but America. It was a pragmatic decision based on the correct presumption that in our shrunken globe, freedom from communism has become indivisible, not for metaphysical reasons, but for strategic reasons. We Americans are prepared, if necessary for our own survival, to give over to darkness the 50,000 Chinese who live on Quemoy and Matsu. But experience shows us that this would not be the isolated consequence of such a default. Such a surrender would be in no different from passing the ammunition to our enemy to make him grow stronger and more terrible and capable of advancing more menacingly, not only upon his neighbors, but upon those who live and work and worship and laugh right here in the United States. I do not need to make to this audience this strategical demonstration. We know that, as it is true that on the fate of Berlin hangs the fate of Europe, on the fate of Formosa hangs the fate of those counter-revolutionary forces in the Far East, on which we rely to keep the enemy at bay and to keep kindled the hope that, God willing, the sun will shine again on quarters of the globe, which are under the long shadow of the dark and dusty corner of the British Museum, where Karl Marx worked, developing his spite against humankind. My motives, then, and let me speak frankly to my friends in China, are not altruistic. I would not commit the United States to a course of perpetual war in behalf of perpetual peace. I choose rather to wage war against the appeasers in our midst, because that war, bloody as it sometimes appears, is infinitely less so than the war we shall have to fight if we continue to appease the enemy and to give him, as already we did in those 3 great crises in Korea and Suez and Cuba, grounds for believing that there is not left in the bourgeois world the will to withstand the presumptions of international Bolshevism. This crisis is distinguished from others we have faced by the singular amount of time Providence has given us to meditate on the consequence of our deeds. Others have cogently demonstrated the emptiness of the argument that we must, in order to face the reality of communist control of mainland China, permit her entry into the United Nations. We have had 10 years' experience and no indication whatever that recognition would have done for us any more than it has done for Great Britain or for other Western powers that rushed unthinkingly into it. A few months after Red China chased the elements of civilization from the mainland, we might have justified diplomatic recognition by abstract reasoning. But for years now, we have seen that there is not a single advantage to be gained from recognition, whereas the disadvantages are striking. It is seriously believed that by recognizing Red China, we would subject her to the pressures of international togetherness and bridle her appetites, mitigate her ideological lust. How have we fared with Russia after 28 years of recognition? Recognition would serve not to teach Red China table manners, but to fortify her in the abiding communist belief that the West is too frail, too rotten, and to be able to resist her most conceited demands, that notwithstanding her studied career as principal desperado among nations, she can force her way into the chambers of an assembly whose charter, in words plain and simple, the text of which was approved in 4 major languages, qualifies for membership only those nations of the world that seek to keep the peace. If the world were sane, and if the leaders of the United States could rise up from liberalism, the debate in the United Nations this fall would not be on the question whether to accept Red China for membership, but on the question whether to expel from membership the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. This audience knows the relevant realities. We know that the persons who press for appeasement in the Far East tend to be the same persons who press for appeasement in all the other theaters of the world. The men and women who call for the recognition of Red China tend to be the same men and women who called for what they termed moderation, what one might call, with a sense of poetic satisfaction, ultra-moderation in Korea, who abominated the efforts of England and France and Israel to repress the errant nationalism of Nasar, who call for the abandonment of the outposts of civilization in Africa, who deplored America's brief flirtation with resolution in Cuba. Ultimately, their arguments must, by logical necessity, come down to surrender. And indeed, this exactly is the naked word that is finally being used by a few brave cowards. For the first time in America, writes Mr. Joseph Alsop, 1 or 2 voices are beginning to be heard, arguing that what ought to be done is to surrender. Mr. Kennedy says Berlin is not negotiable, writes Mr. John Crosby, a fire-breathing columnist for the New York Herald Tribune. Why isn't it? Why isn't anything negotiable rather than thermonuclear war? Are we going to wipe out 2.5 billion years of slow biological improvement in a thermonuclear war? Over what? Berlin? I agree with Nehru that to go to war under any circumstances for anything at all in our world, in our time, is utter absurdity. I certainly think Berlin is negotiable, and, as a matter of fact, Khrushchev is not even asking very much. And, after all, communism is not that bad, and someday we're going to have to face up to that. And Mr. Kenneth Tylan, the English critic, agrees. Better read than dead, he writes. Seems an obvious doctrine for anyone not consumed by a death wish. I would rather live on my knees than die on my knees. Well, assuming it is death towards which we are headed as a result of our determination to stay free, let it be said that Mr. Tynan would not need to die on his knees. He could die standing up like those of his ancestors who died at Runnymede, at Agincourt, at Hastings, at Dunkirk, fighting for the freedom of their descendants to exhibit their moral idiocy. Mr. Crosby appears to have substituted for the American slogan, "Give me liberty or give me death," the slogan, "John Crosby is too young to die, let them live." There remain impenetrable corners of the Soviet Union where Messrs. Crosby and Tynan could store up their 2,500 calories per day and remain absolutely free from the bounds of radioactivity, if not from the horrors of Bolshevism. But let them not contaminate the air that free men breathe. We seek not to start a war, but to avoid war, and the surest way to avoid war is by asserting our willingness to wage it, a paradox that surely is not so complex as to elude the understanding of professional students of drama. The appeasers and collaborationists in our midst seek to pour water into our gunpowder and lead into the muzzles of our cannons, and to leave us defenseless in the face of enemies' musketry. There is no licit use for a nuclear bomb, they are saying in effect, save possibly to drop a small one on General Walker. These are in fact the warmongers, for they whet the appetite of the enemy as surely as a stripteaser whets the appetite of the lecher. However I survey the future, writes Kenneth Tinnan, there seems to be nothing noble in dying. I want my wife to have another child, and I want to see that child learn to walk. Those in the West of civilized mind and heart are engaged in making just that possible. The birth of another child, to Kenneth Tinnan, always assuming he has left the virility with which to procreate one. Ours is the way of life, with freedom. Without freedom there is no life. Let us now, in the name of life on earth, extend our hands to the free Asians and say to them the same words that baptize this nation, that we pledge together our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor.